In 1976, in large part because of his pardoning of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford lost his reelection bid to the Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter. Carter was appealing to voters in part because he was an outsider. He was a Washington outsider. He had never served in Washington, D.C. He had political experience. He had served as governor of Georgia, but um, he had never served in the House of Representatives. He had never served in the Senate. Um, uh, and he had a reputation for being a very moral person. He professed to be a born again Christian, was very serious about his Christian faith, and this proved attractive to many Americans because, especially after Watergate, they were sick and tired of uh, crooked politicians from Washington, D.C. Um, so Carter seemed like someone they could both trust and possibly relate to. In fact, at his inauguration, um, instead of riding in the limousine from the Capitol building to the White House, he actually walked to show that he was a man of the people. Now, one of the issues that Carter inherited from Ford was the energy crisis. Remember, there is a Middle Eastern embargo placed on oil shipments to the United States because the United States helped Israel in its war against Egypt and Syria. Um, uh, several Middle Eastern countries refused to send shipments of oil to the United States. So Carter, for one, created the Department of Energy. He created a new cabinet position, and he tried to make the nation more dependent on other forms of energy other than oil and gas. For example, coal was one suggestion, um, solar panels, and even nuclear power plants. In 1979, there was an accident, and it could have been much more serious, but there was an accident at a nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island. So that really sent the idea of nuclear power plants down the drain. It made many Americans view them as unsafe or unreliable. Also in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Remember, the goal of the Cold War is to stop the spread of communism. Well, here's the Soviet Union invading another country. That's definitely not uh, keeping communism from spreading, or that's definitely not containing communism. And remember, President Ford had just signed the Helsinki Accords, in which the United States agreed to recognize the post World War II boundaries of the Soviet Union. Basically, all of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, the United States was willing to view as part of that nation. Well, now here's the Soviet Union trying to capture more territory. As far as uh, foreign policy goes, Carter's greatest achievement and his greatest failures would both be in the Middle East. His greatest achievement being the Camp David Accords. This was a treaty that was signed at Camp David, which is a vacation retreat for the president. And it was signed between the leaders of Israel and Egypt. Those two countries had been at war with each other for quite some time, and Carter managed to work out a peace agreement between those two nations. This was a huge accomplishment for him. That same year, however, there was a crisis that broke out in Iran. Now, the emperor of Iran was known as the Shah, and the Shah in the late 1970s had been assisted in coming to power by the United States back in the 1950s. So he had more or less been placed in power by the United States. He was not very popular with the people of Iran, and he was bringing westernized ideas to the country of Iran. And this angered many of the citizens. And in 1979, there was a revolution that broke out. It was a revolution aimed at bringing Iran back under fundamental Islamic ideals. They wanted a government that was based on the teachings of Islam. So there's a revolution in Iran. The Shah is overthrown, and President Carter allows him to come to the United States for cancer treatment. Well, when the new government of Iran finds out that the United States is more or less providing sanctuary for the Shah, this man that they hate so much, they're furious. And the Iranians end up attacking the U.S. Embassy in the capital of Iran, which is Tehran. And they capture 66 hostages. Now, they eventually allow some of those to go, those who are women, those who are African American, and those who are ill. But eventually they hold on to 52 hostages. So this was a very embarrassing moment for the United States. Our citizens were being held hostage by the people of Iran, and each day the evening news would remind Americans how long these these hostages had been held prisoner. First 50 days, and then 100 days, and then 200 days, 300 days, 400 days. They were held hostage for eventually 444 days. In April 1980, Carter made an attempt to rescue them, but one of the helicopters crashed and 8 American soldiers were killed. So this was a big flop for him. And so that really hurt Carter's reputation. 1980 was also an election year, and he would lose that election to Ronald Reagan. And this was more so to be an insult to Carter than the Iranians being scared of Reagan. But up until the day that he left the White House, Carter stayed on the phone with the Iranian government trying to get them to release the American hostages. Literally a few minutes after Carter stepped down and Reagan had been sworn in, the hostages were released. And like I said, this was more of an insult to Carter than it was the Iranians being scared of Reagan. But Carter, he is not remembered very fondly for being a successful president, and he left office somewhat in disgrace. At the end of the 1970s, many Americans were starting to wonder if the United States was still a great nation, if they were still the nation that they had grown up in. And if you think about it, in the 1970s, we lost the Vietnam War. The Watergate scandal caused us to really lose faith in our leaders. So there was really a big identity crisis in the United States during these years. And it's during the 1980s under Reagan that the United States is going to start feeling like its old self again.